scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was Sunday afternoon at the Pig family house, and everyone was taking their usual nap. Peppa woke up first. But the house was strangely quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a lazy Sunday, but an empty, hollow silence that made her ears ring. She went to check on George in his room. But his bed was perfectly made as if no one had ever slept in it. His toys were arranged in neat rows, all facing the door, as if they had been watching and waiting for someone to enter. The dinosaur toy that George loved so much was sitting on the pillow, but its plastic eyes seemed to follow Peppa as she moved around the room. Mummy and Daddy Pig's bedroom was the same. The bed was made. Their clothes were folded perfectly, and everything was in its exact place, but there were no signs that anyone had been there recently. No wrinkled sheets, no books left open, no glasses on the nightstand. It was as if they had simply vanished. Peppa called out for her family, but her voice echoed strangely in the house. Instead of the normal echo that bounced off walls, her voice seemed to stretch and distort, coming back to her as whispers from different rooms. The whispers sounded like her family's voices, but they were saying things she had never heard them say before. She went downstairs to the kitchen and found that dinner was already prepared on the table, for plates with steaming food, as if someone had just finished cooking. But the food was wrong. It looked like their usual meals, but the colors were too bright, the shapes too perfect, like plastic food from a toy kitchen set. The living room felt enormous. The purple sofa seemed miles away from the television, and the ceiling stretched up higher than it should have. Peppa's footsteps echoed loudly on the floor, but when she looked down, she couldn't see her feet. The green carpet seemed to ripple and move like water beneath her. The photographs on the walls had changed. They still showed the Pig family, but in each picture, one family member was missing. In some photos, George wasn't there. In others, Daddy Pig had vanished. And in a few, Peppa herself was absent from family moments she remembered being part of. As evening approached, the house began to fill with sounds, footsteps in the hallway, but no one was there. Voices having conversations in empty rooms, the sound of George playing with his toys upstairs. But when Peppa went to check, the room was still empty and silent. The telephone started ringing, but every time Peppa answered it, the line was dead. The television turned on by itself, showing programs she had never seen before. They looked like episodes of her own life, but with small differences. In these episodes, she was an only child, or her parents looked slightly different, or the house had extra rooms she had never seen. By nighttime, Peppa realized she might be completely alone in the house, but the house itself seemed to be trying to convince her that her family was still there. Plates appeared and disappeared from the kitchen table. Beds became unmade and then made themselves again. Lights turned on and off in patterns that seemed almost like a code. The episode ended with Peppa sitting in her bedroom, listening to the sounds of a family that might not exist anymore, while the house around her continued its elaborate performance of normal life, trying to keep her from realizing that she might be the only real thing left in a world that was slowly becoming as artificial as a dollhouse. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Peppa discovered that her house had grown new rooms overnight. She first noticed it when she went to brush her teeth before bed. The bathroom door, which had always been at the end of the hallway, was now in the middle, and there were two more doors beyond it that she had never seen before. The first new door led to a room that looked exactly like her bedroom, but everything was backwards. The bed was on the opposite wall. The window showed a different view, and all her toys were arranged in mirror image. When she looked in the mirror in this backwards room, her reflection waved with the wrong hand. The second new door opened to a kitchen that was identical to theirs. But the family sitting at the table wasn't quite right. There was another Mummy Pig, but her orange dress was purple, another Daddy Pig, but his glasses were square instead of round, and another George, but he was holding a teddy bear instead of his dinosaur. Peppa tried to go back to her real bedroom, but now there were even more doors in the hallway. Each one led to another version of their house, with small differences that made her feel dizzy. In one house, the stairs went down instead of up. In another, the living room had a fireplace that didn't exist in her real home. The strangest part was that in each house, there was another version of her family. They all looked almost right. But something was always wrong. One daddy pig had no mustache. One mummy pig had short hair. One George was taller than he should be. And in every house, there was another Peppa. But she was always doing something different. As the night went on, Peppa found herself lost in the maze of identical but wrong houses. She would think she had found her way back to her real room, only to discover that the wallpaper was a different shade of pink, or that her bed had an extra pillow she didn't remember. The other families seemed unaware that anything was strange. They went about their evening routines as if their slightly wrong houses were perfectly normal. But Peppa noticed that they all moved in the same patterns, at the same times, like actors following a script they had memorized. When she tried to speak to one of the other mummy pigs, the woman looked at her with confusion, as if Peppa was the one who didn't belong. The other Peppa in that house stared at her with eyes that were the same color but somehow different, like looking at herself in a funhouse mirror. By midnight, Peppa had counted 17 different versions of her house, each one almost perfect but wrong in its own way. She began to worry that she might never find her real home again, or worse, that she might forget which differences were real and which were the mistakes. The episode ended with Peppa sitting in what she hoped was her real bedroom. But she couldn't be sure anymore. The room looked right, but so had all the others at first glance. As she closed her eyes to sleep, she could hear the sounds of all the other families in all the other houses, living their almost right lives just beyond the walls. And she wondered if she was the real Peppa, or just another copy in someone else's wrong house. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa's playroom had always been her favorite place in the house, filled with colorful toys and games that brought her joy. But tonight, as she entered to retrieve a forgotten book, the room felt different. All of her toys were arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room, facing inward as if they were having a meeting. The toy telephone was off its hook, emitting a soft dial tone that filled the room with an eerie hum. Her stuffed animals sat upright with their button eyes all turned toward the same spot, the empty space in the center of their circle. As Peppa watched, the toys began to move closer together, tightening their circle with small, jerky movements. The toy piano began to play a melody by itself, its keys depressing with invisible fingers, creating a tune that sounded almost familiar but wrong, like a lullaby played backwards. Her building blocks started to stack themselves into towers that defied gravity, balancing in impossible configurations that should have fallen but didn't. The jack-in-the-box began to turn its handle slowly, the tinny music playing at half speed, creating an ominous countdown to something terrible. Peppa tried to leave the room, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the walls. The toys all turned to look at her simultaneously, their painted faces seeming more alive than they had any right to be. The stuffed animals' button eyes began to glow with a soft, sickly light, and their stitched mouths appeared to move as if they were trying to speak. The jack-in-the-box finally popped open, but instead of the usual clown, a tiny figure that looked exactly like Peppa emerged, its face twisted into an expression of pure terror. The toy Peppa pointed at the real Peppa and opened its mouth in a silent scream, and all the other toys began to move toward her, their movements becoming more fluid and lifelike with each step. The room filled with the sound of mechanical laughter, growing louder and more distorted until it became a cacophony of madness that seemed to come from the toys themselves. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa came downstairs for dinner to find her family already seated at the dining room table. But something was terribly wrong. They were all sitting perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, staring straight ahead with blank expressions. The table was set for dinner, but the plates contained food that Peppa didn't recognize, dark, shapeless masses that seemed to move slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George all turned to look at her simultaneously, their movements perfectly synchronized like clockwork dolls. Their smiles were too wide, stretching across their faces in ways that looked painful, and their eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all. "Sit down, Peppa," they said in unison, their voices flat and emotionless. "It's time for dinner." Peppa approached the table cautiously and saw that her chair was the only one without the strange, moving food. Instead, her plate held what looked like a normal meal, but as she got closer, she realized the food was arranged to spell out words, "Join US." The family continued to stare at her with those horrible smiles, waiting for her to sit down. When she hesitated, they all tilted their heads to the side at exactly the same angle, the movement creating a soft clicking sound like breaking bones. "Sit down, Peppa," they repeated, and this time their voices echoed strangely, as if coming from far away. Peppa noticed that the dining room seemed larger than usual, the walls stretching away into darkness beyond the reach of the overhead light. The family began to eat their strange food with mechanical movements, never breaking eye contact with her, never blinking. As they ate, their smiles grew even wider, and Peppa could see that their teeth had become sharp and pointed. The food on her plate began to rearrange itself, the letters changing to spell out new words. "Stay forever." Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa always brushed her teeth before bed, but tonight something was different about the bathroom mirror. Her reflection seemed to lag behind her movements, creating a disorienting effect that made her feel dizzy. When she raised her toothbrush, her reflection waited a full second before doing the same. When she smiled, her reflection frowned. When she waved, her reflection turned away. Peppa tried to ignore it and continue brushing her teeth, but the reflection began to act independently, brushing its teeth with movements that didn't match her own. The reflection Peppa opened her mouth wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, filling her mouth like a shark's. Real Peppa dropped her toothbrush in shock, but reflection Peppa continued brushing with mechanical precision. The reflection began to mouth words that Peppa couldn't hear, its lips moving urgently as if trying to warn her about something. Suddenly, the reflection pressed its hands against the glass from the inside, and Peppa could see that its fingers were too long, with nails that had grown into claws. The reflection began to push harder against the mirror, and cracks started to appear in the glass, spreading outward from where its hands pressed. As the cracks grew larger, Peppa could hear muffled sounds coming from the other side of the mirror, sounds like crying, like screaming, like someone trapped and desperate to escape. The reflection Peppa's mouth opened wider and wider until it seemed to take up most of its face, and from that impossible mouth came a sound like breaking glass mixed with her own voice calling for help. The mirror finally shattered, but instead of glass falling to the floor, the pieces hung in the air, each one showing a different reflection of Peppa, all of them wrong in their own terrifying way. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa woke up thirsty in the middle of the night and went downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was dark and quiet, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. As she reached for a glass, she noticed that all the kitchen appliances were on, their displays glowing in the darkness, but she was certain they had been turned off before bedtime. The microwave showed midnight but was running anyway, its turntable spinning endlessly. The oven was preheating to a temperature that didn't exist on its dial, and the dishwasher was running a cycle that seemed to go on forever. When she opened the refrigerator for water, she found it completely empty except for a single plate covered with a silver dome. Despite knowing she shouldn't, Peppa lifted the dome and found a birthday cake with candles that lit themselves as she watched. The cake was decorated with a message written in frosting that read, "Happy Birthday, Peppa," but today wasn't her birthday, and the handwriting looked like her own. As she stared at the cake, the candles began to multiply, covering the entire surface until the cake was more flame than food. The kitchen filled with the sound of children singing "Happy Birthday," but the voices were coming from inside the walls, muffled and distorted. The singing grew louder and more discordant, and Peppa realized that the voices belonged to children who sounded exactly like her, all singing at slightly different speeds. The cake began to melt from the heat of the countless candles, but instead of frosting and cake, thick red liquid pooled on the plate. The singing stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, Peppa heard her own voice whisper from behind her, "Make a wish." Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa had lived in her house her entire life, but she had never noticed the small door under the stairs until today. It was painted the same yellow as the walls, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The door was barely tall enough for her to crawl through, and it had no handle, just a small keyhole. When she asked Mummy Pig about it, her mother's face went pale and she quickly changed the subject. Daddy Pig pretended he couldn't see the door at all, walking right past it as if it didn't exist. That night, Peppa heard scratching sounds coming from behind the door, like tiny claws against wood. She crept downstairs and pressed her ear against the door, hearing what sounded like children playing. But their laughter was wrong, too high, too sharp, lasting too long. The next morning, she found a small brass key on her pillow, old and tarnished, that fit perfectly into the door's keyhole. Against her better judgment, Peppa turned the key and heard the lock click open. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch on forever into darkness. Cool air flowed out, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something sweet and rotten. As she peered into the tunnel, she heard her own voice calling from deep within the darkness. But the voice was singing a song she didn't remember learning. The voice grew closer, and Peppa realized with terror that something wearing her voice was crawling up through the tunnel toward her. She slammed the door shut and turned the key, but she could still hear her own voice on the other side, now pleading to be let out.
The visitor from the wall. When it was raining outside, Peppa and George were playing in their room. Everything was as usual: blocks, toys, laughter. But then Peppa noticed something strange. A crack in the wall right next to her bed seemed bigger than before, and inside it, there was something that looked like a face. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Maybe it was just a drop of water running down the wall. But when she looked again, eyes, narrow, dark, motionless, and a mouth stretched into a long, thin smile. Peppa blinked, and the face was gone. She didn't say anything to George. She just turned away and went to sleep, telling herself it was only her imagination. But the next night, she saw it again. The face was closer, and now it moved. Not quickly, no, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if it was sliding beneath the layers of wallpaper. It was like watching a fish beneath the ice. Its eyes moved. They were watching Peppa. Peppa told Mummy Pig, but she only said that maybe the wall was a bit damp. Daddy Pig promised to patch the crack, but when he entered the room with his tools that evening, there was no crack. On the third night, Peppa woke up to a rustling sound. George was asleep, covered completely with his blanket. Peppa slowly turned toward the wall. Now the face was very close. It filled the whole crack. And then it came out. First came a hand, grey, thin, with long fingers like it was made of paper. Then the second hand. It was pulling itself out, blending with the color of the wallpaper. Its body was flat, as if it had always been part of the wall. It made no sound, only movement, slowly, smiling. Peppa couldn't scream. She was frozen, watching as the thing emerged. It had no legs. Its lower body just faded into the air. It slid across the floor, leaving a wet grey trail behind. It approached George's bed and stopped. A few long seconds, and then it disappeared. When the parents came in the morning, Peppa was sitting on her bed staring at the wall. George was asleep, but he never woke up again. The doctors couldn't explain it. They said his heart just stopped. Since then, Peppa no longer sleeps in that room. The wall was painted over, new wallpaper was put up. But sometimes, if you look closely at the pattern, you can see it shifting, as if something is moving underneath, and if you stare long enough, it smiles again.
The scary Peppa Pig episode that never aired. It was bedtime, but Peppa couldn't sleep. Strange sounds came from downstairs. At first, it seemed like her family was still awake, talking quietly. But when she listened carefully, the voices didn't sound right. Peppa tiptoed downstairs and peeked into the living room. Her family was there, standing motionless in a circle, facing each other. They weren't talking, but she could still hear voices, the same voices, but coming from somewhere else as if delayed. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George stood with eyes closed, mouths moving silently. The real voices seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere except from the people themselves. The voices had a normal family conversation about tomorrow's plans, but the words felt empty. Peppa crept back to her room, but the strange sounds continued. Now she heard footsteps walking through the house, but when she looked out the window, her family was still standing in the same circle. The footsteps repeated the same path over and over, kitchen to living room, up the stairs, down the hallway, and back. The footsteps stopped outside her bedroom door. Peppa held her breath. Someone was breathing behind the door, but too quietly to be any family member. The breathing was slow and patient, as if whoever it was had all the time in the world. Peppa whispered, "Mummy." No answer. She tried Daddy, then George, but the breathing continued, steady and calm. Finally, she asked, "Who are you?" The breathing stopped completely. The silence was more terrifying than the sounds. When morning came, Peppa found her family having breakfast as if nothing happened. They laughed and talked as usual, but their voices sounded exactly like those from behind the walls. When she asked about the previous evening, they looked confused and said they'd gone to bed early. Throughout the day, Peppa heard the same footsteps, always invisible, always following the same path. Sometimes she'd turn a corner expecting to see someone, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps had become part of the house itself, a sound that never stopped. That night, Peppa realized the footsteps didn't match her family's routine. They followed a pattern established long ago before she was born, when someone else lived in this house. Someone who was still walking through the rooms, still going about their daily life, completely unaware that anyone else was there.